Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking at the Lucretius text, which is a text to go alongside the Virgil in paper 2. Just to remind you when this would come up in an exam, so this is for standard level Latin only, and it would be in paper 2, in the last question of paper 2, which is the 12-mark essay question, in which you are asked to respond to a prompt, to discuss a prompt in relation to one core verse text and at least one other verse text. So the core verse text is the Virgil Aeneid Book 2, and then you're needing to bring in other verse texts into your essay as well. So the Lucretius is a nice example of some text that you could bring in alongside the Virgil there. The name of the poem, as you can see, is De Rerum Natura. De meaning about or on, natura meaning nature, and rerum meaning of things. So it's essentially a kind of philosophical poem. So let's first of all just think about what this poem really is. So first of all, it's a 6-book poem. It is written in dactylic hexameter, so it's in the same meter as Virgil's Aeneid. It is written by this author, this poet, Lucretius. We don't know exactly when he wrote it, but most scholars think early 50s BC. So if you try to situate that in time, remember that Virgil is starting to write his Aeneid just after 30 BC, so between about 29 and 19 BC. So that puts this text about a generation earlier than Virgil's Aeneid. In terms of the context, and this is really important because examiners will want to see an engagement with context in your essay. And in terms of the context, this is a bad time. This is a bad political time for Rome. There have been various political crises leading up to this point. But I think the most important thing is that Roman democracy, the republican system, is under real strain at this point. Essentially what you have is this group of 3 big players. One is Julius Caesar, one is Pompey, and one is a less well-known figure called Crassus. And these 3 men have basically ganged up into an alliance which they call the First Triumvirate, or I should say we call the First Triumvirate. And that group of 3 men has basically just taken control. So the democracy has been squeezed out. And also, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of gang warfare in the 50s on the streets of Rome. The streets of Rome are running with blood. There are 2 particular gang leaders, one called Clodius and one called Milo, who are leading this. And what is the poem? Well, the poem is a passionate argument for Epicureanism, and we'll talk in a moment about what that is. But it's the kind of it's a Greek philosophy, and if you were to look for it on the shelves of Waterstones or something today, it would be in a kind of self-help section, because it's all about kind of looking inside you to find your inner kind of tranquility and happiness. And this is in some ways very un-Roman, right? For the Romans, if you want to seek self-fulfillment, the way that you do it is by kind of active public life. Go out and get elected as a politician, go out and win wars as a general. The Romans really valued active, military, often quite violent life. That was sort of the pinnacle of life for the Romans. Whereas for Epicureanism, it's much more about seeking your own kind of inner peace and so on. Forget politics, forget the messiness of the outside world, and focus on what's inside you. So it's a really quite un-Roman, countercultural idea. But again, if you put it in its historical context, that makes sense, because the political world of Rome is a complete mess. The politics of the Republic are a complete mess. So for that reason, you can understand why people might be interested in turning away from the old Roman ideal of active public service and focusing more on that inner peace and so on. Okay, what kind of poem is this? Because there's lots of types of poem, right? You could write a kind of military epic, you could write a love poem, you could write a satire or whatever. The genre of this poem is called didactic, which means that it's a poem of teaching. It teaches you something. It's a poem which expounds and sets out a body of ideas, which in this instance are philosophical ideas. So it's a didactic poem. And if you're answering an essay which has anything to do with genre, that is something that you can bring in. Let's now just talk a little bit about what this philosophy is that Lucretius is advocating. So it's a philosophy which is named after a Greek thinker called Epicurus, and basically it has two aspects of it. One is scientific and one is about kind of how we should live. So the scientific aspect is this physics. So it's a set of beliefs about physics that the world is made up of an infinite number of atoms moving around in an infinite amount of space in accordance with physical laws. And some parts of that, I think, sound quite modern in a way. Then the other part is this ethics, right? How we should live. And the ethical view of Epicurus, and then his follower, this poet Lucretius, is that the highest good of human life is pleasure, right? So the main thing that we should aim for in life is pleasure. And the best form of pleasure is freedom from care, being free of anxiety, free of concern, free of worry, right? That is what Epicureans like Lucretius regard as the ultimate goal of human life. So Epicureans like Lucretius also believe that we should not fear the gods, because the gods live a blessed life. That's a sort of standard ancient belief. But then Lucretius and other Epicureans put a bit of a spin on that. They say, okay, if the gods live a blessed life, that means they're free from care. And if they're free from care, it means they cannot be interested or bothered about what we humans are doing. So that's quite controversial, right? For most Romans, you should fear the gods, and you should make sure you do all the right sacrifices, etc., to keep the gods happy. Whereas Epicurus and his followers are saying, no, forget that. Don't worry about the gods. Don't do any sacrifices, just forget it. So again, that's very un-Roman. Then you also have a belief about death, which is that we should not fear death, right? Lucretius says, look, we're just atoms which disperse when we die. There's no afterlife, so who cares about death? You won't be around to experience death. You're not going to be, tortured in hell or anything. Some Romans were quite scared of the underworld, etc. Lucretius says, no, that doesn't exist. Right? There's no soul, there's no heaven or hell or anything like that, so don't worry about it. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's have a look at the opening of the poem. So the poem opens like this: Mother of Aeneas and his race, pleasure of men and gods, nurturing Venus, who beneath the smooth-moving heavenly signs fill with yourself the sea laden with ships, the earth that bears the crops, since through you every kind of living thing is conceived, and rising up looks on the light of the sun. So this is an invocation of the goddess Venus. It's an address to Venus. And it's worth noticing, I think, that the very beginning, the first few words, is very old-fashioned and Roman. Mother of Aeneas and his race. It's immediately invoking that story that we get in Virgil about Aeneas and his mother being Venus. This is classic kind of Roman mythology that Lucretius is referring to. Also, this phrase, of men and gods, hominumque divomque. This is a very old-fashioned Roman phrase. It quotes an earlier Roman poet, Ennius, who was very old-fashioned and so on. So in some ways, it's very Roman, but the big difference is that instead of being told about Jupiter, for example, most Roman epics, if they're focusing on one god, they focus on Jupiter. What we actually get is pleasure. Venus is described as the pleasure, the voluptas of men and gods, right? Normally that phrase of men and gods goes with king, right? Jupiter is king of men and gods. But here we get pleasure of men and gods. So you've got Roman elements and then this very un-Roman element. You'd never get Virgil focusing on pleasure in the first line of, his epic poem, for example. Okay. The other thing to bear in mind is, and again, you don't need to remember all of this, but it just gives you a sense of what Lucretius is doing. The Greek philosopher Empedocles believed that the world was made up of 4 elements, 4 types of stuff: earth, air, water, and fire. And it's worth noticing all 4 of those elements are in this opening passage, because you get, for example, the sea laden with ships, that's the water. You get the earth bearing the crops, which is the earth, obviously. You get the light of the sun, which is the fire. And before that as well, you get the heavenly signs above, so that's kind of the air above us. So you get all of these Empedoclean elements. But, again, Lucretius is doing something different with this. Because for Empedocles, the world has a kind of yin and yang sort of push and pull, love on the one hand and then strife on the other hand. Love is the force that brings things together, and then strife is the force that pulls things apart. Whereas for Lucretius, it's very much love in the driver's seat. It's Venus who is the kind of all-powerful one, right? Because this is the philosophy of Epicureanism. Pleasure is at the center. Therefore, Venus, the goddess of pleasure, is the queen. She's at the top of everything. And then he goes on, "From you, O goddess, from you the winds flee away, the clouds of heaven flee from you and your coming. For you the wonder-working earth puts forth sweet flowers. For you the wide stretches of ocean laugh, and heaven, grown peaceful, glows with outpoured light." And there's something slightly odd here, you might say, which is that this feels like a very passionate religious tone here. But, of course, remember, Lucretius is not really a religious person. He's a materialist, which means that for him, everything that exists is made of stuff, made of physical matter, so there are no spirits or ghosts or anything. And also the gods, if the gods exist at all for Lucretius, then they are far away and they don't care about us. So you might think, well, what is an irreligious person, an unreligious person like Lucretius doing, using this very religious tone in his poem? And I think he wants to show us that his philosophy is not joyless and boring. He wants to say, okay, my philosophy doesn't really include the gods and spirits and religious sacrifice and all that, but it's not boring and, uninteresting. That, we can still experience joy and awe and wonder at the world. Okay, and then let's go on a bit. "For as soon as the spring days show their lovely face, and the breeze of the teeming west wind blows fresh and free, first the fowls of the air proclaim you, divine one, and your approach, pierced to the heart by your might. Next, wild creatures and farm animals dance over the rich pastures and swim across rapid rivers." So you get this sense of the whole of nature responding to the goddess Venus. And again, pleasure. Because Lucretius has this Epicurean belief, pleasure is at the center of everything. And Venus is the personification of that pleasure. Okay. "So greedily does each one follow you, held captive by your charm, wherever you go on to lead them. Then throughout seas and mountains and sweeping torrents and the leafy dwellings of birds and verdant plains, striking alluring love into the hearts of all creatures, you cause them greedily to beget their generations after their kind. Um, and it's worth just noting, actually, that word generatim, after their kind. This is a very old-fashioned word, so, as a Roman reader, you feel like you're reading something sort of traditional, but it's also, in a way, quite a modern idea because of it's basically the idea of species. So this is not a random world. This is a world governed by scientific laws. And that is, again, part of the picture that Lucretius wants to set out, is that the world is governed by scientific laws. That may seem obvious to us in the 21st century, but it was not necessarily obvious to ancient Romans. To go on, since therefore you alone govern the nature of things, since without you nothing comes forth into the shining borders of light, nothing joyous and lovely is made, you I crave as partner in writing the verses which I attempt to fashion on the nature of things. Okay, now this is, in some ways very traditional, in some ways quite radical. It's traditional because Lucretius is invoking a divinity to inspire his work, right? This is very typical of epic poetry, where you ask a muse or something to inspire your work, right? Virgil does this as well. In the beginning of the Aeneid, Virgil says, "Muse, tell me the causes," etc., etc. So, in that sense, this is a very typical feature of a poem. But again, he says to Venus, he says, "You alone govern the nature of things." Well, again, that's not very Roman. If you ask most Romans who alone governs the nature of things, they would say, well, Jupiter, really, if you want me to pick one person. But so again, the idea that Venus, that love or pleasure governs the nature of things, very radical, very un-Roman. So the whole of this opening is a weird mix of traditional and radical. That's the key, I think, to understanding the opening of the poem. And then he says, "For my friend Memmius, whom you, goddess, have willed at all times to excel, endowed with all gifts, therefore all the more grant to my speech, goddess, an ever-living charm." I think this is just worth noticing as well, because Roman literature involved patronage, right? If you wanted to make a living as a writer, you need money. And the way you got money was by having a patron, someone who paid you to write. And then it's a kind of win-win situation, because you get the money and the patron gets to look civilized and cultured and impressive because they have this great poet working for them. Okay, and I think it's just worth bearing this in mind. Gaius Memmius was clearly a big patron of literature, because when he went to be a governor of the Roman province of Bithynia, he actually took two poets with him to do that, Catullus and Cinna. And I think the reason this is relevant, or could be relevant in an essay, is just to think about that idea of patronage, right? How important is patronage or contemporary circumstances to the writing of a poem? Well, for Virgil, it's massively important, because his patron is the Emperor Augustus. And in a way, the whole poem could be seen as praise of Augustus through, his ancestor Aeneas. So likewise in Lucretius, there is this idea of, the patron Memmius, and Lucretius has to praise him a bit, right? He has to say that Memmius has been endowed with all gifts, for example. So that's just a little comparison between Virgil and Lucretius. Okay. "Cause meanwhile the savage works of war to sleep, and be still over every sea and land, for you alone can delight mortals with quiet peace, since Mars, mighty in battle, rules the savage works of war." So again, this idea of calming peace, setting up war as a kind of enemy to pleasure. And again, it's worth bearing in mind, this is very countercultural, because for Romans, war was basically a good thing, especially if they're winning. Okay, and then here Lucretius is still talking about Mars. She says, Mars, who often casts himself upon your lap, wholly vanquished by the ever-living wound of love, and thus looking upward, with shapely neck thrown back, feeds his eager eyes with love, gaping upon you, goddess, and as he lies back, his breath hangs upon your lips. So again, beautiful poetry here. The idea of love kind of lying helplessly Mars lying helplessly in the lap of Venus. Again, very un-Roman. The idea of the god of war being this sort of helpless lover. This is very counter-cultural. Okay, there, as he reclines, goddess, upon your sacred body, do you, bending around him from above, pour from your lips sweet coaxings, and for your Romans, illustrious one, crave quiet peace. For in this time of our country's troubles, neither can I do my part with untroubled mind, nor can the noble descendant of the Memii, at such a season, be found to fail our country in its need. So, again, Lucretius is saying, well, this is a very difficult time. Essentially, I need to do my bit, and Memmius needs to do his bit, right? We both need to do our jobs for Rome. And then he says, I pray to you for peace, for the very nature of divinity must necessarily enjoy immortal life in the deepest peace, far removed and separated from our affairs, for without any pain, without danger, itself mighty by its own resources, needing us not at all, it is neither appeased with services nor affected by wrath. So this is the very un-Roman view of religion that Lucretius has, that gods are not appeased with services, in other words, they don't care about sacrifice, nor do they get angry. Right, and the Romans would totally disagree with this on the whole. Gods love sacrifices, and they do get angry in traditional Roman religion. And then, when man's life lay for all to see, foully grovelling upon the ground, crushed beneath the weight of superstition, which displayed her head from the regions of heaven, frowning over mortals with horrible appearance, a man of Greece was the first that dared to uplift mortal eyes against her, the first to make stand against her. Again, very controversial. Lucretius is talking about humans being crushed beneath the weight of superstition, or religio in Latin. So he's basically saying religion is a bad thing. And this is very controversial because in ancient Rome, of course, most of the aristocracy, the wealthy, were involved in religion. In a different way from in modern Britain, it was something everyone was involved in, so that the rich would be priests or augurs or something. And the other thing just to understand is that when Lucretius says the man of Greece was the first who dared to uplift mortal eyes against her, he's talking about Epicurus. So he's presenting Epicurus as a hero for standing up against religion. Okay. 4. Neither fables of the gods could defeat him, nor thunderbolts, nor heaven with menacing roar, but all the more they spurred on the eager courage of his soul, so that he should desire, first of all men, to shatter the confining bars of nature's gates. Therefore the lively power of his mind prevailed, and forth he marched far beyond the flaming walls of the world. So Lucretius is presenting Epicurus as the hero, right? But he's an unusual kind of hero because the idea is he's fighting against the gods, right? The gods are throwing their thunderbolts against Epicurus. That puts Epicurus in the role of a kind of giant or titan, right? An enemy of the gods. And that's unusual. Normally heroes work with the gods, whereas Epicurus is a sort of anti-god hero. He's a hero who struggles against the gods. Okay, as he traversed the immeasurable universe in thought and imagination. From there, victorious, he returns bearing his prize, the knowledge what can come into being, what cannot, in a word, how each thing has its powers limited and its deep-set boundary mark. Therefore superstition is now in her turn cast down and trampled underfoot, while we by the victory are exalted high as heaven. So the idea is that Epicurus brings scientific understanding, and thus humanity is freed from superstition and kind of raised up into a kind of glorious state of enlightenment. So there's a bit of the kind of Richard Dawkins, if you like, about this sentiment from Lucretius. Lucretius then says, "One thing I fear in this matter, that in this, your apprenticeship in philosophy, you may perhaps see impiety and the entering on a path of crime. Whereas, on the contrary, more often it is that very superstition which has brought forth criminal and impious deeds." So Lucretius is anticipating a criticism that he thinks his readers might have. He thinks his readers, who are good religious Romans, might look at this poem and think, no, 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 this isn't for me. I'm a good religious Roman. This man is clearly an evil atheist. I need to just throw this book away. And Lucretius says, he does something very bold here. He says, no, no, don't do that. Because he says, well, actually, it's not that atheism is immoral or anti-religion is immoral. He says it's actually religion which is immoral. Right? Which, again, shocking for a Roman audience. Lucretius is saying religion itself is what produces evil acts, right? Not atheism. So again, if you read, Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett today, you will get these very same ideas. Christopher Hitchens wrote a whole book called God is Not Great, arguing basically that religion, I think the subtitle is something like How Religion Poisons Everything, right? The idea that it's religion that produces bad things rather than atheism. And that's what Lucretius is doing here, right? He's saying, actually, it's not anti-religion that produces crime. He says it is religion itself, superstition, which has brought forth criminal and impious deeds. And then he gives an example. As when at Aulis, the altar of Our Lady of the Crossways was foully defiled by the blood of Iphigenia, shed by chosen leaders of the Greeks, chieftains of the host, as soon as the ribbon had bound her maiden tresses, falling in equal lengths down either cheek, as soon as she saw her father standing sorrowful before the altar. Okay, so what's going on here? This is the story of, it's a story from the Trojan War. The Greeks are on the way to the Trojan War. They get stuck in a place called Aulis. They can't get the winds that they need to blow them onwards to Troy. And a prophet tells them that in order for them to get favourable winds to go on to Troy, the king of the Greek forces, Agamemnon, has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, which he does. And this is a bit of classic kind of Greek mythology, but Lucretius is doing something new with it. He's saying this is an example of how religion makes people do bad things, right? Because it is Agamemnon's religiousness which makes him sacrifice his own daughter. That's the point. What he does is he sacrifices his daughter to the goddess Diana, or Artemis, who's the one referred to here as Our Lady of the Crossways. And we're told that Iphigenia has a ribbon on her hair. This ribbon is a label, basically, which labels her as a sacrifice, a victim for sacrifice. And this whole business with her hair falling down, her hair let down, and her father by the altar, it's presenting it almost like a wedding, but of course it's like a perversion of a wedding. It's like a horrible wedding because it's actually her sacrifice. So the key point here is, religion is the cause of the evil act of Agamemnon. So remember, Lucretius's main point is, don't put down this book because you think, oh, it's atheism, so it must be evil. Lucretius is saying, no, religion is really what drives people to do bad things, just like when Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter for the gods. Okay, and then we go on. And by his side, attendants hiding the knife, and the people shedding tears at the sight of her. Dumb with dread, she sank to the ground upon her knees. Alas, poor girl! No help could it be to her at such a time, that the name of father had been bestowed on the king first by her. For lifted up by the hands of men, all trembling, she was brought to the altar, not so that amid solemn and sacred ritual she might be escorted by loud wedding songs, but a clean maiden to fall by unclean hands at the very age of wedlock, a victim sorrowful slain by a father's hand, all in order that a fair and fortunate release might be given to the fleet. So potent was superstition in persuading to evil deeds. So again, you see the point here that religion leads to evil deeds. That is what Lucretius is trying to tell us. So, if you were answering an essay about views of the gods, for example, in poetry, this would be a key thing to bring in. Okay, let's look at a different passage now. This is another part of Lucretius. This is more about his physics. This is his argument for why the universe must be infinite, why it must go on forever. So let's read it here. Besides, if all the existing space be granted for the moment to be finite, so he says, let's imagine that the universe is finite. Suppose someone proceeded to the very extremist edge and cast a flying javelin. Do you prefer that the javelin forcibly thrown goes where it was sent and flies afar? Or do you think that anything can hinder and obstruct it? Now, I'll talk in a moment about what his argument is, but one thing just to notice first is that Lucretius is using a very Roman image of throwing a javelin, because this was how the Romans declared war. So this image of throwing a javelin across a boundary, this is what Romans did to declare war. They symbolically threw a javelin into the enemy's territory. But on the other hand, the belief Lucretius is trying to persuade us of is that the universe is infinite, right? Now, that is very un-Roman. The Romans generally believed the universe was finite, and that was important because the priests had to be able to divide it all up into chunks. So again, this, as I said before, Lucretius is combining Roman traditional things with new and radical things. So he's using Roman traditional imagery, like the javelin, but he's using it to argue for un-Roman ideas, like the universe being infinite. And then he goes on, for you must confess and accept one of the two, but each of them shuts you off from all escape and compels you to accept that the universe stretches without end. For whether there is something to hinder and keep it from going where it is sent and from fixing itself at its mark, or whether it passes out, that was no boundary from where it was sped. In this I shall go after you, and wherever you place your extremist edge, I shall ask what at last happens to the javelin. Okay, so just to explain briefly Lucretius's argument here, he's saying, all right, let's imagine the universe is finite, right? If it's finite, it must have a limit, and there must be nothing beyond that limit. So he says, okay, let's imagine that we walk to the edge of the universe and throw a javelin at the edge of the universe. Well, he says one of two things must happen. Either the javelin must be stopped by something, or it must go on. And he says if the javelin gets stopped, it must be stopped by something. So there must be something on the other side of the boundary to block the javelin. So if the javelin gets blocked, then there must be something beyond the edge of the universe. On the other hand, if the javelin keeps going, then the question is, where's it going? So if it keeps going, there must be something beyond this edge of the universe. So the point is, if you go to the edge of the universe and throw a javelin, whatever the outcome is, there must be more universe beyond that edge. And if you go to a further edge, the same issue arises, and a further edge, and a further edge, and a further edge. So in the end, the point is that there must be no edge to the universe. So Lucretius is arguing the idea that the universe has an edge, a limit, just doesn't work, doesn't make any sense. So the universe must be infinite. Now, for the exam, you don't need to understand really the philosophical argument here. I think it's quite an interesting argument, but you don't need to really understand that. What's more important is, I think, the literary point. First of all, that Lucretius is using his poetry in a didactic way, right? He's using it to teach us philosophy, if you like. And secondly, that he's constantly doing this thing of combining the Roman with the un-Roman, right? So he's using the Roman image of throwing the javelin into enemy territory, but he's using it to argue for the un-Roman belief in an infinite universe. Okay, finally, one last section of Lucretius, which is about a different topic again that we mentioned earlier, the irrationality of fearing death, right? This is a key Epicurean belief that you should not fear death. So let's have a look. He says, "For if after death it is an evil to be mauled by the jaws and teeth of wild beasts, I do not see how it should not be unpleasant to be laid upon the fire and to shrivel in the hot flames, or to be packed in honey and stifled, and to be stiff with cold, lying upon a slab of cold marble, or to be buried and crushed under a weight of superimposed earth." Now I've put a quote here from E.J. Kenny, who is a classicist, a scholar who writes about Lucretius, who says the chilly discomfort of this situation, in which the body has no covering, is ironically contrasted with that of the body, the buried body, which has too much. So Lucretius here, he's kind of attacking the traditional Roman belief that it really matters sort of how you die. So for the Romans, the idea of being, your body being unburied and being torn apart by wild animals and stuff, that's a horrible idea. The Romans had a real terror of your corpse being kind of mistreated in that kind of a way. And Lucretius is saying, well, that doesn't really make any sense. And he's being a bit jokey here, right? He's saying, well, okay, sure, it doesn't sound very nice being mauled by wild beasts, but on the other hand, doesn't sound very nice being cremated either. Nor does it sound very nice being, cold on a slab of marble where, you haven't got any covering to keep you warm. On the other hand, it isn't very nice to be crushed under the earth, being buried, and then you've got too much covering. So Lucretius, he's being very jokey here, and he's saying, look, whatever you do with a dead body doesn't sound very pleasant. So, it's completely irrational to say, oh, I don't mind being cremated or I don't mind being buried, but don't let my body be mauled by wild beasts, right? He says that doesn't make any sense. And his basic point that underlies this is, look, once you're dead, you don't feel anything. So it really doesn't matter any of this stuff, what happens to your body or anything like that. You're gone, so forget about it. All right, let's read on a little bit. "No longer now will your happy home give you welcome. No longer will your best of wives or your sweet children race to win the first kisses and thrill your heart to its depths with sweetness. You will no longer be able to live in prosperity and to protect your own. Poor man, they say. One fatal day has robbed you of all these prizes of life." So that last phrase, that last bit, poor man, and so on, Lucretius is kind of quoting the sort of language that Romans used in eulogies, right? Funeral speeches. But then, here's the twist. Lucretius says, but they do not go on to add, no longer too does any craving possess you for these things. If they could see this clearly in their mind, and so conform their speech, they would free themselves from great anguish and fear of mind. So, the point is, when you die, Lucretius says, okay, it's true that you can't enjoy what you enjoyed in life. You can't enjoy your friends, you can't enjoy your family, you can't enjoy your money, that kind of thing. Okay, that's true. But on the other hand, you're dead, and therefore you cannot desire these things either. Right? So Lucretius says, when we're thinking about death, we shouldn't just focus on the things that we lose. We should focus on the fact that we will not be around to miss those things. Right? And therefore, he says once we understand that we will not be alive or sentient, we won't be able to miss what we had in life. Once we understand that, we don't need to fear death anymore. Okay. So just very briefly, just to go back to where we started, after we talked about the historical context, we started with these key beliefs of Epicureanism: the physics, the ethics, the idea that we shouldn't fear the gods because the gods don't care about us and so on, and we shouldn't bother about the gods, and then also the fact we shouldn't fear death. So that's 4 points, if you like, and all 4 of them we can see in the text that we've read. So the physics we encountered in the point about the javelin, and the javelin example proving that the universe is infinite. The ethics we met in the opening, because the opening presents Venus or pleasure as the highest, the greatest thing that exists. The point about not fearing the gods and not being religious, we met that when we saw the point about Agamemnon and Iphigenia. And then finally, the point about not fearing death is the point that we met at the very end, with all the bit about, being mauled by animals versus being buried versus lying on a cold slab of marble. So all 4 of these key bits of Epicurean doctrine we have met in these different bits of the poem.